The courtroom fell so silent that Ella Norris could hear the blood rushing through her own ears. Every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas had crowded into that sweltering room on the second floor of the jailhouse, and every one of those souls had spent the last 3 days whispering that she was a liar. The year was 1882, and in a town where a woman's word meant less than the dust on a man's boot, Ella had stood at that wooden podium and spoken the truth anyway. She had watched the judge's eyes narrow. She had watched the jury foreman scratch the back of his sunburned neck. She had watched Harlan Voss, the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 counties, smile the slow, greasy smile of a man who believed he owned the outcome of this trial the same way he owned his livestock. And then she had watched Sheriff Bernard Wilcox stand up. He had not asked permission. He had not been called to testify again. He simply rose from his chair near the door, tall and lean and immovable as a lone post oak after a prairie fire, and he had turned to face not the judge, not the jury, but her. He had looked directly at Ella Norris across every head in that packed, airless room, and he had said in a voice so clear and deliberate that the words struck the far wall and came back again, "You told the truth, and I will make sure everyone hears it." The room erupted. Harlan Voss shot to his feet. His attorney grabbed his arm. 3 women in the back row gasped loud enough that one of them knocked her neighbor's bonnet sideways. The judge slammed his gavel. The jury foreman stopped scratching his neck entirely. And Ella Norris, who had not wept once through 4 days of testimony that had stripped her dignity down to the bone, felt her throat close around something hot and enormous that was not quite grief and not quite relief and not quite love, though it contained elements of all 3. She had not known Bernard Wilcox well 6 months ago. She had not trusted him. She had good reason not to trust any man who carried a badge in Redemption Creek, because the last man who had carried that badge had been the instrument of her ruin. But that was the beginning of the story, and to understand why those 7 words broke something open inside her chest in the best and most terrifying way, you had to go back to the spring, to the day everything first went wrong, to the afternoon Ella Norris arrived in Redemption Creek carrying nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of employment, and a secret that someone else had already decided would destroy her. The stagecoach had lurched into Redemption Creek on the 17th of April, 1882, trailing a plume of pale dust that settled over the main street like flour over a baking board. Ella was 26 years old and had traveled 3 days from San Antonio with 1 other passenger, a traveling dentist named Mr. Hobbs who slept through every bump and spoke in his sleep about teeth. She had pressed her forehead to the window and watched the town assemble itself out of the flat Texas landscape. A general store, a livery, a barber shop with a striped post that needed repainting, a hotel that called itself the Majestic but looked more like the Practical, a saloon. 2 churches, which told her something about the local argument between sin and salvation. And at the end of the main street, square and solid and painted a color that might once have been white, the combined office of the sheriff and the town's single jailhouse. Ella stepped down from the coach and felt the April heat press against her like a wall. She was here because of a letter. 6 weeks before, she had answered an advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Express placed by a Mr. George Norwood, who owned the largest dry goods enterprise in Redemption Creek and required an experienced bookkeeper. Ella had been a bookkeeper in San Antonio for 4 years, working for a merchant named Aldridge who had treated her fairly and paid her honestly until he died of a fever in January, and his brother came from Memphis to dissolve the business. She needed work. The letter from Mr. Norwood had been prompt and generous and had promised a salary of $30 a month and lodging above the shop. What the letter had not told her was that George Norwood was the brother-in-law of Harlan Voss, and that Harlan Voss had a dark past with every person who worked in that shop, and that Redemption Creek had a hidden motive buried under every smile it offered to a newcomer. She did not know any of that yet. She picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the Majestic Hotel to wait for Mr. Norwood, and as she crossed the street she nearly walked directly into the broadest chest she had ever encountered at close range. "Beg your pardon, ma'am." The voice was deep and unhurried. She stepped back and looked up. The man was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more, with dark brown hair tucked under a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had a face that was serious without being unkind, the sort of face that had made a habit of watching things carefully before speaking about them. He wore a sheriff's star on his vest, polished to a brightness that stood out against the worn leather. "My fault entirely," Ella said, because it was half true. He touched the brim of his hat. "You just come in on the stage." "I did." "You have business in town." There was nothing rude in the question. It was the question of a man whose job was to know what was happening in his territory. "I do," she said. "I am the new bookkeeper for Mr. Norwood's dry goods store." Something moved briefly across his expression, too quick for her to name it. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," he said. "I am Sheriff Bernard Wilcox. If you need anything while you are getting settled, my office is at the end of Main Street." "Ella Norris," she said. "Thank you, Sheriff." He touched his hat again and walked on. She watched him go for just a moment longer than was entirely necessary, then shook herself and went to find the hotel. George Norwood appeared within the hour, a broad, cheerful man with red cheeks and a handshake like a bear trap. He showed her the rooms above the shop, which were clean and simply furnished, and explained her duties, which were straightforward. She would manage the accounts, handle correspondence with suppliers, and track the inventory. She was good at all of these things. She settled in quickly, and for the first 2 weeks, Redemption Creek seemed like nothing more than a dusty, ordinary town where she might build an ordinary, decent life. Then she found the second set of books. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in early May, when she was reorganizing the filing cabinet that sat behind the main counter, and discovered a false bottom in the lower drawer. She would not have found it at all had the drawer not jammed, and forced her to pull it entirely free of the cabinet to inspect the runners. The false bottom held a leather-bound ledger, old and creased, filled with figures written in a hand she did not recognize. She spread it on the counter and read it for 20 minutes before she understood what she was looking at. The figures recorded payments, large payments, made at irregular intervals over a span of approximately 3 years, from accounts identified only by initials, to a recipient identified as H.V. Harlan Voss. And beside each payment, a brief notation of what the payment secured: safe passage of cattle across county lines without inspection, the dismissal of a complaint filed by a rancher named Alderman regarding water rights, the sudden departure of the previous sheriff, a man named Cole Fletcher, from Redemption Creek, the silence of a witness in a land dispute case that had gone to the county court 2 years prior. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Ella's arrival. It recorded a payment of $200 to an unnamed party described only as the new arrangement, with a note that read, "Pending the bookkeeper situation." Ella stood very still for a long moment. Then she put the ledger back, replaced the false bottom, slid the drawer closed, and went upstairs and sat on her bed and thought with great care about what she had seen and what it meant, and what, if anything, she was going to do about it. She thought about it for 4 days. During those 4 days, she was polite to George Norwood and competent at her work, and gave no indication that anything was different. She bought flour and coffee at the general store. She attended Sunday service at the larger of the 2 churches. She ate supper twice at the hotel dining room, because the evenings alone above the shop felt heavier than usual. The second time she was at the hotel, she sat at a table near the window and watched Bernard Wilcox cross the street outside, and she thought about the look that had crossed his face when she mentioned George Norwood's name. She thought it had been recognition of something unpleasant. On the 5th day, she made a decision. She went back to the filing cabinet, retrieved the ledger, and copied out the most significant entries into a small notebook she had bought for personal correspondence. She returned the original to its hiding place. She did not yet know what she was going to do with the copy, but she knew that having it was better than not having it, because the entry about the pending bookkeeper situation had not stopped bothering her, and the dark past it suggested for everyone involved had a way of making the present feel like a trap. She was right that it was a trap. She simply did not know yet how quickly it would spring. On the 15th of May, George Norwood came into the shop on a Saturday afternoon when he usually played cards at the saloon, and he went directly to the filing cabinet, and he spent approximately 10 minutes at it before he emerged with his red face gone a different color entirely. He looked at Ella behind the counter. She met his eyes with perfect calm and waited. "I need you to come with me," he said. "Where?" "To speak with Harlan Voss." She had known this was coming. She had not known it would come quite so fast. "All right," she said, because refusing would have told him something, and she was not ready for that yet. Harlan Voss's ranch was 3 miles east of town, and it was the kind of property that existed to demonstrate that its owner had more than everyone else. The house was the largest in the county, 2 stories of white-painted timber with a wide porch running the entire length of the front, and it sat in the center of land that stretched farther than the eye could follow. There were men with rifles visible near the barn. Ella noted them and kept her face still. Harlan Voss himself was 60 years old, and had the look of a man who had been handsome once, and had allowed prosperity to soften and corrupt those good looks into something harder to define. He met them in his front parlor, which was furnished with the aggressive opulence of a man who needed everyone around him to understand his status at all times. He shook hands with George Norwood. He did not offer his hand to Ella. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is considering whether to keep or discard. "Miss Norris," he said, "George tells me you are settling in well." "I am," she said. "The work is straightforward." "Good." He poured himself a glass of whiskey from a decanter on the sideboard and did not offer her one. "I want to speak to you about the nature of your position. The dry goods store is a family enterprise. George's wife is my sister. What happens in that business affects my family's interests. I need to be certain that the person managing those interests understands the importance of discretion." Ella understood exactly what he was saying. "I am a bookkeeper," she said. "I record what is given to me to record. I don't involve myself in matters outside my duties." Voss watched her for a moment. "That is the correct answer," he said, "as long as we understand one another." She returned to town that evening in George Norwood's wagon and went upstairs to her room and sat with her small copied notebook on the table in front of her. And she thought about discretion and what it cost and what it protected. She thought about the rancher named Alderman whose water rights complaint had been bought away. She thought about the witness who had been silenced. She thought about the former sheriff, Cole Fletcher, whose departure had been arranged. She thought about the phrase pending the bookkeeper situation, and she understood that she was being shown the shape of the trap before it closed, as a courtesy or a warning or both. Harlan Voss was a careful man who preferred that the people around him understood their situation before they made mistakes that would require correction. She was not going to be corrected. But she also recognized that walking into Bernard Wilcox's office tomorrow morning and laying her notebook on his desk would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done, because she did not yet know whether the current sheriff was any different from the previous one, whose departure the ledger had recorded so neatly among its columns of betrayal. She spent another 2 weeks watching Bernard Wilcox without letting him know she was watching. It was easier than it might have been, because the sheriff had a daily routine as regular as a train schedule. He walked the main street every morning at 7, stopping at the bakery for coffee. He was at his office by 8. He ate dinner at the hotel dining room on Tuesdays and Fridays. He visited the telegraph office every Wednesday afternoon, which suggested he was in regular correspondence with someone in another town, possibly the county seat. He played no cards that she observed, visited the saloon only to break up disputes, and attended the smaller of the 2 churches, which surprised her, until she noticed that the larger congregation included George Norwood and most of the prominent men who figured in her copied notebook. She watched him with people. He was fair in a way that was not performative. He returned a horse to a Mexican vaquero that a local rancher had claimed as his own, based on nothing more than a scar pattern on the animal's flank that matched the vaquero's description, and he did it without apparent concern for the rancher's displeasure. He spent an afternoon helping an elderly widow named Mrs. Garrett nail down a loose section of porch board, and he charged her nothing and said nothing about it afterward to anyone. She heard him tell a young man who had come to him with a grievance about a card game that the grief of losing money did not justify the violence of recovering it, and he said it without contempt, as though the distinction was genuinely important to him. These were not the actions of a man whose silence had been purchased. On the first day of June, she walked into his office. Bernard Wilcox looked up from his desk with the steady attention he seemed to give everything, and he said, "Miss Norris, what can I do for you?" Ella closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which was the chair that defendants and complainants and troubled citizens used, and she placed her small notebook on the desk between them and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to know first whether you can be trusted." He set down his pen. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. "That is a fair question," he said. "And I cannot prove the answer to you in advance. All I can tell you is that I took this job because the man who had it before me was corrupt, and I have no intention of following his example. You know about Cole Fletcher." "I know enough," he said. "I was the deputy who filed the complaint that led to his removal, though removal was made to look like resignation for political reasons I was not party to." He paused. "You have information about what he was involved in." "I have information about what he is still involved in," she said. "Because the man who was paying him is still paying people, and the man who replaced Fletcher is apparently the next item on the list." Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm exactly, but the heightened alertness of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he hoped was wrong. "Show me," he said. She opened the notebook and walked him through it. He read carefully and asked precise questions and did not interrupt her unnecessarily. When she finished, there was a silence between them that had a different quality from the silence before she had spoken, the way the air changes after lightning. "This is enough to open an investigation," he said. "But it is not enough to take to a court, because it is a copy, not the original, and Norwood will have moved the original the moment he understood it had been discovered." "I know," she said. "I did not take it because I did not want him to know that I had found it." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You have put yourself at considerable risk by coming here," he said. "You understand that." "I understand that doing nothing was also a risk," she said. "The last entry in that ledger refers to a pending bookkeeper situation. I would rather be a risk to them than have them be a risk to me." He met her eyes, and she saw in his something that she had not expected and was not quite prepared for, something that recognized her. "I am going to need time to build this properly," he said. "In the meantime, I need you to stay in place, behave as you have been, and come to me directly if anything changes. Do not share this with anyone else. Not the judge, not the mayor, not any of the men who take their Sunday dinners at Harlan Voss's table, which is most of the prominent citizens in this town." "Who can we trust?" He was quiet for a moment. "Myself, you, the telegraph operator, Frank Dean, who has been sending my correspondence to the state attorney's office for the past month. And a rancher named Alderman who has his own reasons to see Harlan Voss answered for." The name from the ledger. She felt the shape of it connect. "The water rights." "He lost his water rights and nearly his ranch," Bernard said. "He has been waiting for someone to believe him for 2 years." They looked at each other across the desk, and there was something in that moment that was more than the transaction of information. It was the recognition of two people who had chosen the same side of a line when the easier and safer choice was to pretend the line did not exist. She stood to leave. He stood as well, which was a courtesy she did not expect from a man in his position, and for a moment they were both standing in the small space of that office with the June light coming through the single window and the weight of what they had just committed to hanging in the air between them. "Miss Norris," he said, "thank you for trusting me." "I have not decided entirely whether I trust you," she said honestly. "I have decided that you are the best available option." His mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, but was too serious to complete itself. "That is as much as I deserve at this point," he said. She walked back to the dry goods store through the June heat and felt something she had not felt in months, which was the specific and peculiar comfort of not being entirely alone with a dangerous secret. She did not examine the feeling too carefully. There was too much work ahead. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Ella's life. She went to work every morning and recorded numbers with perfect accuracy, and spoke to George Norwood about invoices and suppliers with the serene expression of a woman who had nothing on her mind but columns of figures. She watched Harlan Voss come and go from the shop, and she watched the way George Norwood's posture changed when Voss was present, the particular combination of deference and anxiety that told her the cattle baron's grip was not comfortable even for the people it protected. She spoke to Bernard Wilcox 3 more times in June, always in his office, always with the door closed, and they exchanged information in the careful, precise way of people who are building something structural and cannot afford loose joints. The 3rd time they met, something changed. He had been telling her about a shipment of altered cattle brands that he had intercepted on the road north of town, which connected to the water rights scheme in the ledger through a ranching partnership she had identified in her copied figures. And he was laying out the connections on a piece of paper with a quiet systematic intelligence that she found herself watching with something beyond the immediate requirements of their shared project. He had rolled up his sleeves against the heat, and his hat was on the desk, and he looked, without the formal elements of his office, like a man who was doing something he believed in without needing to perform the believing for anyone. She said, "How did you come to be in law enforcement?" He looked up. The question was personal, and they had not traded personal questions yet, and he recognized the shift. "My father was a judge in Missouri," he said. "He was one of the good ones, which made it harder, not easier, because the bad ones never respected him for it. I wanted to do the thing he could not always do, which is enforce the law before it had to be a judgment." He paused. "Why did you become a bookkeeper?" "Numbers make sense," she said. "People often do not, but numbers always tell the truth if you know how to read them. And what truth are these numbers telling you right now?" She looked at the paper between them, the connecting lines he had drawn between names and figures. That Harlan Voss has been the shadow government of this county for at least 3 years, and that everyone who might have stopped him was either bought or removed, and that the only reason it has gone on this long is that no one has had the right combination of evidence and willingness. "Until now," he said. "Until now," she agreed. Their eyes held for a beat longer than necessary. She looked back at the paper. He picked up his pen. They continued working. She began to understand that what she felt in those hours in his office was something she had not allowed herself to feel for some time. It was not the dizzying, ungovernable thing that romantic stories described, though it contained some of those elements. It was more like the sensation of finding solid ground after a long walk over uncertain terrain. It was trust, which she had told him she had not yet fully given him, and which she was giving him anyway, 1 degree at a time, without quite meaning to. She also began to understand that he felt something. She had not spent years reading figures without developing an accurate eye for the small variables that told the real story. He was careful with her in a way that was specific and deliberate. He made sure she was seated before he sat. He noticed when she looked tired and adjusted the pace of their working sessions. He never asked her to take a risk he was not prepared to take alongside her. These were small things, and she told herself they were simply the conduct of a decent man, which they might be. But decent men did not also have that particular quality of stillness that came over them when she entered a room, as though everything had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. In July, the investigation took a sharp turn. Frank Dean, the telegraph operator and their most important outside contact, was found unconscious behind the telegraph office on a Tuesday evening with injuries that were not accidental. He recovered, but his hands shook afterward, and he told Bernard privately that a man he did not recognize had warned him that people who sent certain kinds of letters to the state capitol had short careers in Redemption Creek. The letter to the state attorney's office, which had contained a preliminary summary of the evidence Bernard had compiled, had been intercepted. They were running out of time. Someone had told Voss that the sheriff was building a case. Ella came to Bernard's office that Thursday, earlier than usual, before the town was fully awake. He was already at his desk, and he had the look of a man who had not slept. She sat down and said, "Who told him?" "Someone in the county clerk's office," he said. "I have not determined who yet, but it does not change our immediate problem. Voss will move against us before the state attorney can respond to a replacement letter." "What does moving against us mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "For me, it means manufactured charges or an accident. For you, it means your removal from the bookkeeper position or something worse." The word worse sat in the room between them. "So we cannot wait," she said. "No," he said, "we cannot wait." He had been turning something over in his mind while she spoke. She could see it. "There is a rancher named Alderman who went to the county court 2 years ago about the water rights. The case was dismissed because the witness was silenced, which we have documented. If Alderman can reopen that case, and if we present the ledger as new evidence discovered during a criminal investigation, we can force the court to hear it. The judge assigned to that district is not connected to Voss. He is in Abilene. I have confirmation of that." "Getting the original ledger without Norwood knowing it is gone," she said. "Yes. That will require timing." "It will." He looked at her steadily. "George Norwood drives to the Voss ranch every Saturday afternoon. He is gone from 3 until 6. His wife does not come into the shop on Saturdays. I will need someone inside the shop while I search that cabinet." She understood what he was not saying. "I can be there," she said. "I can get you into the shop." Ella, he used her first name. He had not done that before, and they both registered it. "If this goes wrong, Voss will use it to destroy you. You will be the one charged with theft or conspiracy or whatever he can make stick. I cannot ask you to carry that." "You are not asking," she said. "I am telling you I will be there." She held his gaze. "I found the ledger. I copied it. I walked into your office 6 weeks ago and handed you the most dangerous information in this county. I am already committed to the outcome of this. Do not treat me as someone who needs to be protected from the risk she has already chosen." The look that crossed his face then was not the careful professional attention he had maintained through their meetings. It was something more raw and unguarded, something that belonged to a man rather than a sheriff, and it was gone quickly, but she saw it, and she held it privately like a coal against the cold. "Saturday at 3, he said. Saturday at 3. She led him into the shop through the back door, and he went to the cabinet while she stood at the front window watching the empty street. Her heart was moving faster than usual, and she controlled her breathing and watched. He was at the cabinet for 8 minutes. Then he was behind her again, and she turned, and he was holding the ledger. "It is all here," he said. They stood very close in the narrow space behind the counter because the shop was not large, and she felt the controlled force of his relief and her own relief, and something else that occupied the space between those two things. "Thank you," he said, and she understood that he meant more than the immediate success. "Let us finish it," she said. What followed was a month of preparation. Rancher Alderman came to town and made a sworn statement. The ledger was authenticated by a document examiner brought from Abilene by the state attorney's representative, a young lawyer named Cates, who arrived quietly and left quickly, and told Bernard the case was strong enough to proceed. Summonses were issued. Harlan Voss was notified that he was to appear in the district court held in Redemption Creek on the 22nd of August, 1882. When Voss received the summons, the town changed temperature. People who had been friendly to Ella became careful. George Norwood did not speak to her at all, which was better than what she had feared, which was that he would dismiss her and force her to leave town before the trial. But he did not dismiss her, because dismissing her would have drawn attention, and Voss had apparently calculated that keeping things quiet served him better. He had attorneys. He had money. He had 3 years of accumulated influence and a dozen men in this county who owed him their comfort and livelihoods. He was confident. Ella Norris had a ledger and a sheriff and the truth. She saw Bernard every day during those final weeks, and the nature of their meetings had changed in a way that neither of them named, but both of them understood. The professional distance had compressed. He brought her coffee one afternoon without being asked, having learned how she took it through simple observation, and he set it beside her elbow and went back to his side of the desk without comment, and the ordinary intimacy of it shook her more than anything grand or dramatic could have. She thought about what she wanted, honestly, in the way she applied honest reading to her columns of figures. She wanted this to succeed. She wanted justice for the people Voss had harmed. She wanted to stay in Redemption Creek, in the rooms above the shop, in this dusty, ordinary town that had been made extraordinary by the presence of one man who believed in doing things correctly. And on the Tuesday before the trial began, sitting across from him in the long golden light of a late summer evening, she told him a truth that had nothing to do with ledgers. "When this is over," she said, "I intend to stay here." He looked at her. Something in his expression was very still and very concentrated. "That is good to know," he said carefully. "I am not telling you for any practical reason related to the case," she said. "I am telling you because I believe you should know what I intend, and because you deserve the same honesty from me that I have been asking you to extend to this investigation." "Ella," the word was quiet. "I know," she said. "I know the timing is not appropriate." "It is not the timing," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying very carefully not to allow what I feel toward you to influence my professional judgment or to place any additional weight on you during a period when you are already carrying a considerable burden." She felt the warmth of that move through her. "You have succeeded," she said, "at the professional part." He looked at her steadily. "And the other part?" "The other part is visible," she said, "to someone who reads figures." A silence settled between them that was full rather than empty. He reached across the desk and briefly covered her hand with his, a touch that lasted only a few seconds and said everything that did not need words. Then he sat back and straightened the papers in front of him and said, with the ghost of a smile she had been cataloguing for weeks, "First the trial." "First the trial," she agreed. The trial of Harlan Voss opened on the 22nd of August in the jailhouse courtroom, which was the only room in Redemption Creek large enough to hold the proceedings. The state attorney had sent Cates, who was young but competent and had the ledger and alderman's testimony, and the documented record of intercepted correspondence and Frank Dean's account of being assaulted. Voss had 3 attorneys, the best money available in a 200-mile radius. He sat at his table in the finest suit in the room and wore the expression of a man attending an inconvenience. The first day was preliminary. The second day was the defense presenting its theory, which was that the ledger was a forgery created by a disgruntled employee, meaning Ella, and that the testimony of Alderman and Frank Dean was unreliable because both men had grievances against Voss that predisposed them to fabrication. The third day, Ella was called to testify. She had known this was coming. She sat in the witness chair and answered Cates's questions with the same precision she brought to ledger entries, laying out what she had found, and when, and how, and why. The defense attorney, a florid man named Pemberton who seemed to believe that volume and aggression could substitute for fact, spent the better part of an hour attempting to establish that she was vengeful, unstable, motivated by some personal animus against her employer, romantically entangled with the sheriff in a way that compromised her credibility and his conduct, and had fabricated the evidence together as part of a conspiracy. The romantic entanglement point landed in the courtroom like a dropped lantern. There was murmuring. Ella felt the heat of every eye in the room and held herself very still and answered Pemberton's questions with the same level, measured accuracy she had used for Kate's, neither confirming nor denying nor deflecting, simply describing what was true and what she had seen and what she had documented. She did not look at Bernard during this portion of the examination, because she knew that looking at him would give Pemberton something to work with, and she was not going to give Pemberton anything he had not already manufactured for himself. Pemberton's final question was delivered with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had the killing stroke. "Miss Norris, is it not true that everything you claim to have found in that filing cabinet is nothing more than numbers on a page that could mean anything, interpreted by a woman whose interpretation happens to align perfectly with the agenda of the man she is in love with?" The room was absolutely silent. Ella Norris looked at Pemberton with the calm that comes not from not caring, but from caring so much about the truth that every distortion of it becomes almost peaceful to correct. "Everything I claim to have found," she said clearly, "is documented, authenticated, and supported by independent testimony. The interpretation does not require my feelings about anyone. Numbers tell the truth whether or not the person reading them is loved." She paused one beat. "And the truth is not less true because someone who tells it happens to love someone." It was the most she had admitted to herself or to the room, and she felt it move through the air like a stone through still water. Pemberton sat down. The judge called a brief recess. It was in the first minute of the recess, while the room was filling with the noise of people shifting and whispering, and the judge's clerk was consulting his notes, that Bernard Wilcox stood up. Ella had just returned to her seat. The distance between them across the room was perhaps 20 feet of packed, airless humanity, and it did not matter. He looked directly at her, and in the voice that had caused her to feel something crack open in her chest, he said, "You told the truth, and I will make sure everyone hears it." The room erupted. The judge gavel slammed. Voss's attorneys objected to everything. Pemberton stood and sat and stood again. And in the middle of all of it, Bernard Wilcox did not sit down and did not look away and did not retract a single word. The judge, who had come from Abilene and did not owe Harlan Voss a single favor, called the room to order with the authority of a man who had seen more disorderly rooms than this one. He addressed Bernard directly. "Sheriff Wilcox, you will take the stand at this time, or you will be held in contempt of this court." Bernard walked to the stand. He was sworn in. He did not perform calmness. He simply was calm, in the way of a man who has decided what he is going to do and has nothing left to fear about the decision. Kate's, adapting quickly to the unexpected development, examined him with a series of precise questions. Bernard described, in full and accurate detail, the investigation he had conducted over the previous 2 months. He described the intercepted correspondence and the assault on Frank Dean. He described the recovery of the original ledger and the chain of custody he had maintained. He described the authentication process and the document examiner's findings. He described the connection between the ledger entries and the specific incidents they recorded, including names, dates, and dollar amounts. He then said, without being asked and without preamble, "I want to address the suggestion that my investigation was compromised by a personal interest in Ella Norris. Every piece of evidence I have presented was gathered according to lawful procedure and independently corroborated. The character of Miss Norris as a witness is beyond question. She came to me at considerable personal risk when she could have protected herself by staying silent. That is not the behavior of someone with a corrupt motive. That is the behavior of a person who believes in the law more than she fears the consequences of upholding it." Pemberton objected. The judge sustained it on technical grounds, but the words were already in the room and in the record. Voss's legal team worked for 2 more hours to dismantle what had been built, and they worked well because they were expensive and practiced. But the ledger was real and authenticated, and the entries were specific, and the testimony of Alderman and Dean and Bernard and Ella formed a structure that money and volume could not reshape into something other than what it was. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Then they came back. Guilty on the charge of bribery of a public official. Guilty on the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Guilty on the charge of fraud in the matter of the Alderman water rights dispute. Harlan Voss sat in his finest suit and received the verdict with the same controlled expression he had worn throughout. But Ella, watching him, saw the moment when the control slipped. Just slightly, just enough. And what was underneath it was not rage but something older and colder. The look of a man who had believed for so long that he was exempt from consequences that the arrival of consequences was genuinely disorienting. George Norwood, who had been present in the courtroom as a material witness and had been named in the proceedings, aged 10 years in the span of 30 minutes. He was arrested before the courtroom had fully cleared. Ella stood in the emptying room with the sound of the gavel still ringing in her memory, and the afternoon light coming through the high windows at an angle that turned the dusty air gold, and she breathed in and out and felt the enormous pressure of the past months begin, incrementally, to release. She felt him before she saw him. He was beside her, not touching, simply present, and she turned her head and found Bernard Wilcox looking at her with the full force of everything he had been careful about for weeks, no longer careful, no longer withheld. "It is over," she said. "Most of it," he said. "There is still the sentencing and the paperwork and the state attorney's proceedings at the county level, but yes, the essential part is over. How do you feel?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Like I can say things I have been not saying for 2 months," he said. The courtroom had cleared almost entirely. The judge's clerk was gathering papers at the far end. The late afternoon sun turned everything warm and the whole room had the quality of aftermath, the specific exhale of a crisis resolved. "Then say them," she said. He turned to face her fully. "I have spent the last 2 months trying to be the professional you needed me to be," he said, "and trying to be fair to you in the most basic sense, which meant not making the situation you were already in any more complicated by telling you that the day you walked into my office with that notebook and told me you had decided I was the best available option, I was already hoping you would change your estimation." He paused. "I was hoping you would find reasons to trust me. And every day that you did, I was aware that I was not being entirely neutral about it, which was a problem I had to manage." "Did you manage it?" she asked. "Professionally," he said. "Yes. And personally?" "No," he said simply. "Not even slightly." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, because she had not laughed much in the past months and her throat had forgotten the feel of it, and the surprise of hearing herself made the laugh a little larger than she expected. He smiled fully then, for the first time she had seen, and it reorganized his face into something she understood she was going to want to see for a very long time. She reached up and touched his jaw, the same deliberate, chosen gesture he had used when he covered her hand that evening, and she said, "Bernard, I told you in that courtroom that the truth is not less true because someone who tells it happens to love someone." "I heard you," he said. "I meant it." He covered her hand with his where it rested against his face, and he turned his head slightly to press his lips to her palm, and the simplicity of it was so much more than anything elaborate could have been that she felt it move through her from that point outward through everything. "I know," he said against her hand. "I know you did." The clerk's shuffling papers reminded them where they were. She lowered her hand and he held it properly. Their fingers laced, and they walked out of the courtroom and down the stairs and out onto the main street of Redemption Creek in the late August light. And the town they walked into was not the same town she had arrived in 4 months before, and they were not the same 2 people who had stood in this street and nearly collided on an ordinary April afternoon. The weeks that followed the verdict were busy in the particular way of aftermath, when the crisis is over but the clearing of the wreckage still requires sustained effort. Harlan Voss was sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville for bribery and obstruction, and his cattle operation was subjected to an audit by the state that would take months to complete and would result in restitution to several of the ranchers, including aldermen, whose interests he had manipulated. George Norwood received a lesser sentence of 2 years and a substantial fine. The county commission, most of whom had benefited from Voss's arrangements in small or large ways, spent a difficult autumn being questioned by the state attorney's representatives, and 2 of them resigned before December. Frank Dean's hands gradually stopped shaking. He sent a telegram to Bernard one October morning that said only everything is fine now, and Bernard read it at his desk and nodded to himself as though agreeing with a point in a private conversation. Rancher Alderman's water rights were formally reinstated by the county court in September. He rode into Redemption Creek on a gray horse on the day the paperwork was signed, and he sat down in the hotel dining room and ate a meal with Bernard and Ella, and did not say much because he was not a man of many words. But when they stood to leave, he gripped Bernard's hand and then turned to Ella and said, "Ma'am, I had a witness 2 years ago and she lost her nerve. You did not lose yours. I am grateful." And then he walked out and they heard him ride away, and Ella felt something in her chest settle permanently into a position it had not been able to find before. She had been given a new position by the replacement proprietor of the dry goods store, a woman named Mrs. Hatch, who had purchased the business from George Norwood's wife at a fair price while Norwood was awaiting his sentencing. Mrs. Hatch was a practical, honest woman who paid Ella $35 a month and minded her own business in the best possible sense, meaning she engaged fully with what was in front of her and did not pretend there was anything shameful in a single woman having a professional skill and using it. Bernard came to find Ella at the shop on a Thursday afternoon in October, which was not one of his usual days to come by, and he appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is not entirely confident it sounds the way he practiced it. Mrs. Hatch looked at him, looked at Ella, set down the bolt of fabric she was pricing, and said with perfect timing, "I believe I need to check on the inventory in the back room," and disappeared. Bernard watched her go and then looked at Ella. "She is a perceptive woman," he said. "She is," Ella agreed. "Bernard, you look like you are about to say something significant." "I am," he said. He set his hat on the counter. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, which means I have to say some things before I ask it." He took a breath. "When I came to Redemption Creek 2 years ago to take this job, I thought the work was the point. I thought doing the job well was sufficient reason to be anywhere. I had not been wrong about that exactly, but I had not been right about it either, because being right about it would have meant that the last 6 months felt like only work, and they have not. They have felt like the beginning of something I did not have before, which is a life that includes another person who is as necessary to me as anything I have ever known." Ella was very still. He reached into his vest pocket and placed on the counter between them a ring. It was a simple gold band with a small oval garnet, dark red against the metal, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months, not because of its material qualities, but because of what the placing of it meant. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because the trial is over and you might otherwise leave, and not because of anything practical or convenient. Because you are the most honest person I have ever known and the most courageous, and because sitting across a desk from you has been the best part of every day for 4 months, and because I want to sit across from you for the rest of them." Ella looked at the ring. She looked at him. She was aware that her eyes were doing something she could not entirely control, and she was aware that she did not care. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He did not say anything. He simply picked up the ring and came around the counter and took her hand and placed it on her finger, and then he kept her hand in his, and she looked up at him at this proximity that was new and entirely correct, and he lowered his head and kissed her with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything he did that mattered to him. Mrs. Hatch made a small sound from the back room that she might have been trying to suppress. They drew apart and Ella laughed again, that surprise of a laugh, and Bernard looked at the doorway to the back room and then back at her, and the expression on his face was one she was going to spend a long time learning the variations of, and she was entirely prepared to do that. "I should probably tell the clerk at the courthouse to expect us," he said. "Probably," she said. They were married on the 14th of November, 1882, in the smaller of Redemption Creek's two churches, the one Bernard attended, which had a minister named Reverend Garland who delivered a service that was brief and sincere, and did not waste anyone's time with ornamentation. The witnesses were Mrs. Hatch, Frank Dean, and rancher Alderman, who had ridden in that morning on his gray horse and cleaned up considerably for the occasion. The church was cold because November in Texas could be more severe than it had any right to be, and the stove had been lit but was still finding its temperature, and Ella could see her own breath and she did not mind at all. She wore the best dress she owned, dark blue wool that she had bought in San Antonio 3 years ago for a reason she could no longer remember, and she had not known when she packed it into the carpet bag in April that she was bringing it to this. Bernard wore his good suit, dark gray, and he had found time to have his hair cut in the morning, and he stood at the front of that small, cold church and watched her walk toward him with an expression of settled, full happiness that was not performance and not ceremony but simply the most honest thing in the room. Reverend Garland said the words. They said the words back. Bernard placed his hands on either side of her face and kissed her properly in front of God and the 4 witnesses, and the small congregation of Redemption Creek citizens who had come because word travels in a small town, and most of them, even the ones who had been uncertain about where to stand during the Voss proceedings, felt some form of investment in the outcome of this particular story. Mrs. Garrett, the elderly widow whose porch Bernard had repaired, cried openly and said it was the cold. They had supper at the hotel that evening, the wedding party and a handful of friends, and Frank Dean gave a toast that was much longer than he had apparently planned and went in several unexpected directions, but arrived, eventually, at something genuinely moving. Alderman raised his glass and said nothing at all, which was his version of an eloquent speech. Bernard and Ella walked home through the November dark to the house he had lived in since his arrival in Redemption Creek, a modest timber frame house 2 streets back from Main Street, with a kitchen that needed new shelves and a bedroom window that looked east toward the open country. She had not seen the inside of it before tonight. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelves and said, "I can fix those." He stood in the doorway and looked at her in his kitchen and said, "I know you can." "This is a good house," she said. "It is better than it was 10 minutes ago," he said. She turned around. He was still in the doorway, looking at her with that quality of attention he had always given her, and she understood that she was going to be looked at that way every day, and the enormity of how much she wanted that settled over her like something warm and complete. "Bernard," she said. "Ella," he said. She crossed the kitchen and he met her halfway, and that was the end of the conversation for a considerable time. The winter passed in the particular warmth of a household becoming itself. Ella reorganized the shelves, and Bernard did not interfere with the reorganization, which she considered one of his finest qualities. She continued working for Mrs. Hatch through the spring, taking her time transitioning from the bookkeeping to managing the accounts from home, which Mrs. Hatch agreed to with the flexibility of a woman who believed in practical arrangements. Bernard was at his office during the days and home in the evenings, and they sat together after supper at the kitchen table, she with her accounts and he with whatever paperwork his office generated, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. In February of 1883, 2 things happened that mattered. The first was a letter from the state attorney's office, informing Bernard that his handling of the Voss investigation had been formally commended, and that there was interest at the state level in his approach to what the letter called systematic corruption in rural jurisdictions. The letter suggested, without quite offering, that there might be a role for him in the training of other sheriffs in similar situations. Bernard read the letter at supper and handed it to Ella, and she read it and looked at him and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think you are very good at your job," she said. "I think Redemption Creek is better for having you, and I think the towns mentioned in that letter would also be better for having you, and I think the question is what kind of life we want." She set down the letter. "Tell me what you are thinking." "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that Redemption Creek is where you and I began, and I am not certain I want to carry us somewhere else before we have fully begun." He paused. "And I am thinking that the letter is not going anywhere, and that if the state attorney has interest in this work, he will still have interest in 6 months or a year." "So you are thinking we stay," she said. "For now," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." "It is entirely agreeable to me," she said. The second thing that happened in February was that Ella sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and looked at the untouched coffee she had poured for herself and understood that she was going to need to tell Bernard something. She waited until he came downstairs, which was not long, because he rose early out of habit. He sat across from her and looked at her face and said, "What is it?" she told him. She watched his face move through the information with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then she watched it arrive at the meaning of what she had said. And what happened to his expression then was something she had not quite anticipated. He looked at her with a joy so complete and unguarded that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way very bright light is. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, and she felt his breath against her hair, and he said nothing for a long moment because he was apparently managing the feeling before trusting himself with words. And then he said quietly into her hair, "We are going to need to fix more than the kitchen shelves." She laughed, muffled against his shoulder. "We have time." They had time. Through the spring of 1883, Redemption Creek continued the slow process of reinventing itself after the departure of Harlan Voss's influence. New names began appearing on the county commission, some of them known to Ella and Bernard as people who had stayed quiet during the Voss years, not out of complicity, but out of fear. One of them was a woman, which was not as unusual as it might have seemed, because several Texas towns in this period were beginning to recognize that competence did not require a specific kind of face, and Redemption Creek had just spent a year being saved in significant part by a woman with a notebook and the willingness to use it. Bernard made 3 trips to neighboring counties during the spring on behalf of the state attorney's informal initiative, consulting with sheriffs who were facing their own versions of the problems Redemption Creek had navigated. He was careful to arrange these trips so that he was not gone from home for more than 3 days at a time, and Ella was careful to tell him that she did not require this consideration, and he was equally careful to do it anyway. Alderman came to town in April with a small herd of cattle and a proposal to sell Bernard and Ella a plot of land adjacent to the alderman property, a quarter section of flat, good ground with water access that was now fully and legally secured. Bernard discussed it with Ella over 3 evenings of supper. She said, eventually, that she thought land was a reasonable investment for people who intended to be somewhere for a long time. He agreed. They bought the land with no immediate plan for it, simply because owning a piece of this country that had cost them something felt right. On the 3rd of July, 1883, their son was born. He was a healthy, insistent presence from the first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise, measuring gaze. They named him James Daniel Wilcox, after Bernard's father, the judge. Bernard stood in the bedroom doorway holding his son with the careful, reverent attention of a man who has been given something he understands he does not fully deserve and intends to earn every day. And Ella, watching from the bed where she was recovering with Mrs. Hatch's efficient assistance, thought that she had never seen him look more himself. "Hello, James," Bernard said to the baby, very quietly. The baby, who had opinions about everything already, expressed one. "He agrees with you," Ella said. "He is being polite," Bernard said. "He will have questions later." She smiled. The afternoon light came through the east window at the particular July angle that turned everything gold and soft, and the house was full of the small sounds of itself, and she was so entirely in the right place at the right time that she stopped trying to contain it and simply let it be what it was. The summer of 1883 moved slowly and warmly through Redemption Creek, the way good summers do when you are paying attention. James Daniel Wilcox grew rapidly and with great personal determination, learning to turn over at a pace that alarmed and delighted his parents. Ella returned to her work for Mrs. Hatch in September, taking James to the shop in a basket that sat beside the counter, and from which James supervised the dry goods business with the critical eye of a very young man who had not yet decided whether commercial enterprise met his standards. Mrs. Hatch adored him, which she expressed by completely ignoring him most of the time, and then suddenly holding him for 20 minutes while making sounds that were entirely inconsistent with her practical, businesslike character. Frank Dean, whose hands had fully recovered, came to supper at the Wilcox house one November evening and brought a cake that his wife had made and which was excellent. His wife, a quiet woman named Ruth who had been in Redemption Creek longer than anyone and knew everyone's history, sat at the table and told Ella and Bernard the story of Redemption Creek before Harlan Voss's influence became what it was, the town as it had been when she arrived as a young woman, and what it might become now that the shadow had been removed. It was a good story. James, passed between adults throughout the evening, slept through most of it, which Ella took as evidence that he had inherited his father's quality of being at ease in good company. The winter of 1883 into 1884 brought cold, and the satisfying industry of a household with an infant, which involves constant motion and the kind of tiredness that is also a form of fullness. Bernard took the night shifts with uncomplaining regularity, and Ella, who had expected to have to negotiate this, found instead that negotiation was unnecessary because he had already decided what the fair arrangement was and implemented it. She told him once, on a cold February night when James had been settled after an extended period of having opinions about being awake, that she had not known it was possible to feel this much confidence in another person's reliability. He had looked at her from across the bed where he was already almost asleep and said, "You read the numbers and they told you the truth." She thought about that for a moment. "They did," she said. "You always knew how to read them," he said, eyes closed. "You just had to find numbers worth reading." She lay in the dark and thought about that until she was also asleep. In the spring of 1884, the state attorney's initiative became official. Bernard was appointed as a regional consultant on law enforcement conduct, a position that required him to travel to other counties 4 times a year and to submit written assessments of their practices and needs. The position paid an additional salary, which they put toward the alderman land, where Bernard had begun to talk with increasing specificity about a house. Not to leave the town house, which had become home in the most settled and permanent sense, but to build something on the land that could serve as a second presence, a place for Alderman himself to consider them neighbors in the way that mattered. Ella went with Bernard on one of his consulting trips in June of 1884 to a town called Clayton's Ford that was having trouble with a similar variety of political corruption to the kind Redemption Creek had known. She left James with Mrs. Hatch, who was delighted to have him for 3 days, and rode beside Bernard on the stage and looked at the country moving past the window and said, "This is the same land that I traveled through to get here." "Is it different now?" he asked. She considered the flat grassland, the pale sky, the distant line of low hills. "It looks the same," she said, "but I am different in it. I know where it is going. I know I am coming back." He laced his fingers through hers on the seat between them. "We are," he said. In Clayton's Ford, they met a sheriff named Hanks who was 50 years old and had been doing his job with integrity for 20 of them, and was exhausted and lonely, and needed someone to tell him that the way he was doing it was right. Bernard told him. Ella, whose presence surprised Hanks at first, found herself in a conversation with Hanks's deputy about accounting practices in small-town law enforcement that turned out to be genuinely useful to both parties. When they left, Hanks shook Bernard's hand and then, after a brief internal debate that was visible on his face, shook Ella's as well and said, "They say the Voss case was as much your doing as the sheriff's." "It was a shared effort," she said. "The truth usually requires more than one person willing to say it," he said. She thought about that for the entire ride home. James was returned to them by Mrs. Hatch in excellent condition, and with the information that he had eaten enthusiastically, slept reasonably well, and had strong preferences about which specific corner of the shop he wanted to sit in, preferences which Mrs. Hatch had honored because life was too short to argue with a person who knew what he wanted. The years settled into themselves with the particular beauty of a life lived on chosen terms. The house on Main Street was home. The land east of town was a place they went in the evenings when the weather allowed, to walk the ground and imagine the future structure of it, and Bernard built a fence along the north edge of it in the fall of 1884 with Alderman's help, and James sat on Alderman's gray horse and held the saddle horn with both hands, and looked out over the land with the expression of someone calculating its potential. In the autumn of 1884, Ella discovered she was expecting again. She told Bernard on a Sunday morning, the same ritual as before, and he received the news with the same full happiness, possibly a fraction more settled this time because he knew now what it meant and what it would bring, and he pulled her into his arms and she heard him laugh softly against her hair, a sound of pure, unguarded joy that she had come to understand was one of his rarest expressions, and therefore one of his most valuable. "James is going to have opinions about this," he said. "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly," Bernard said. She considered this. "From which side?" "Both," he said without hesitation. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was milder than the previous one, which seemed generous. James, now a year and a half old and mobile in a way that required constant supervision, had developed a deep interest in his father's hat, which he treated as a personal toy with an owner who had not yet understood its true purpose. Bernard allowed this. The hat suffered. Neither of them mentioned the hat. On the 21st of May, 1885, their daughter was born. She was small and decisive, with her mother's coloring and her father's way of looking at things with a quality of patience that seemed too old for someone so newly arrived. They named her Catherine Rose Wilcox. James, who had been informed of the situation in terms he could understand, inspected his sister with the serious evaluation of a property assessor, and then patted her head with a gentleness that made both his parents exchange a look over his head that needed no words. Bernard held Catherine in the early morning of her second day, standing at the east window with the new summer light coming in, and Ella watched him from the bed and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The stagecoach, the filing cabinet, the small notebook, the door of the sheriff's office closing behind her on a June afternoon when she had not yet decided whether to trust the man on the other side of the desk, the trial, the 7 words spoken across a packed and silent courtroom that had cracked something open in her chest and let the light in. She thought about the version of herself who had stepped off the stagecoach on the 17th of April, 1882, with a carpetbag and a letter of employment and a secret that she was carrying alone. She thought about how thoroughly that aloneness had been replaced by its opposite. She thought about how the replacement had happened, not in a single dramatic moment, though there had been dramatic moments, but in accumulated increments of shared work and shared risk and shared honesty, until the aloneness had been so thoroughly occupied by another person's presence that she could no longer locate where it had been. "What are you thinking?" Bernard said from the window, without turning, because he had learned to read her silences the same way she had learned to read his. "I am thinking about April 1882, she said. He turned then, holding Catherine against his chest, and looked at her with the full, warm attention she had been the object of for 3 years now and had not stopped being grateful for. And I am thinking that numbers tell the truth if you know how to read them, she said. But sometimes you need another person to help you see what the numbers are saying. He smiled. It was the full smile, the one that had reorganized his face the first time she saw it complete, the one she had spent considerable effort cataloging and had not yet finished. "Is that what I did?" "You did a number of things," she said. "That was one of them." He came away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, Catherine tucked in one arm, his free hand covering hers on the blanket, and Redemption Creek moved around them in its daily motion, the sounds of a town that had corrected its course and was finding its way forward, and the morning light turned everything in the room the color of something worth keeping. 2 streets over, Mrs. Hatch was opening the dry goods store. Frank Dean was sending the morning telegrams. Rancher Alderman was riding his gray horse across the land that lay east of town, the land with the fence along the north edge, the land that was waiting for whatever the Wilcox family decided to build on it next. The Voss case had been a settled matter for nearly 3 years. The ledger was in the state attorney's files in Austin. The water rights were secured. The men who had been complicit in small and large ways had either answered for it or moved on, and carried the accounting of their choices privately, the way people do when the external consequences have run their course but the internal ones continue. Bernard had been reappointed as sheriff in the election of November 1883 without opposition, which was not a foregone conclusion given the disruption the Voss case had caused to the established order, but which reflected what the majority of Redemption Creek had concluded, slowly and in private, about the value of a man who did his job the way it was supposed to be done. The commendation from the state attorney's office had been framed, at Ella's insistence, and hung in the front hallway of the house on Main Street. Bernard had said this was excessive. She had said that exceeding what was minimally required was something she had recently come to appreciate. He had looked at her with that expression that was not quite a smile, and was better than a smile, and had not argued further. James turned 2 in July of 1885, 2 months after his sister arrived, and the coincidence of having 2 small children in a warm summer was clarifying in the specific way that physical demands always clarify what actually matters to a person. What mattered, it turned out, was exactly what Ella had suspected, and what the numbers had been telling her since the day she first sat across from Bernard Wilcox in the small office at the end of Main Street. What mattered was this house, and this man, and these children, and this town that had made them a family by being the place where a brave act and an honest heart had found each other. On a Thursday evening in August, after the children were settled and the supper dishes were cleared, and the late summer dark had come down soft over Redemption Creek, Ella and Bernard sat on the front porch of the house on Main Street in the way they often sat in the evenings when the weather allowed, in the 2 chairs that faced the street, and the night sky that arched enormous over the flat Texas country. The stars were bright the way they were bright in places far from cities completely, without competition. "Tell me something," she said. It was an old invitation, one they had developed over the years of evenings like this. He thought for a moment. "When I was 16, he said, my father took me to a courtroom in Jefferson City and let me watch a trial, not a famous case. A man who had taken someone else's cattle and lied about it. Simple, ugly, small. But my father wanted me to see the mechanism of it, the way a lie, when it is exposed systematically and patiently, cannot survive contact with a sufficient accumulation of contrary truth." He paused. "I thought about that trial a great deal during the Voss proceedings." "What did you conclude?" "That the mechanism holds," he said. "If the people operating it are willing to hold it." She was quiet for a moment. "You held it," she said. "We held it," he said. The night settled around them. A dog barked somewhere on the far side of town. The sheriff's office at the end of Main Street had its lamp burning, as it always did at night, a steady light at the far end of the street that was also a promise. The stars continued their enormous, indifferent presence, which was somehow companionable rather than cold. Ella reached across the distance between the chairs and he took her hand without looking, the way you reach for something you know exactly where it is. And they sat in the dark with the warm summer night around them, and the children sleeping inside, and the land stretching away in every direction full of possibility and the future, which was the best kind of future, the kind that had been earned. Redemption Creek was not a perfect town. No town in Texas in 1885 was perfect, and perfection was not the point. The point was that it was better than it had been, that the people in it were being governed more honestly than before, that the water that flowed through Alderman's property flowed there by right rather than by permission, that the old corrupt arrangement had been exposed and answered for, and that the woman who had found the ledger was sitting on a porch with her husband on a warm August night with 2 children sleeping inside and 35 more years of good mornings ahead of them at minimum, and that the numbers, when she read them, were telling a very fine truth indeed. James Daniel Wilcox, who would grow up to be a fair and thorough man, would one day ask his mother how she had known what to do when she found the ledger in the filing cabinet. She would tell him that she had not known entirely. She had known that doing nothing was a choice with consequences, and doing something was a choice with consequences, and that between the two, the one that required courage was usually the one worth making. She would tell him that she had found a man who understood that, and that together they had done what neither of them could have done alone. She would tell him that this was not the exception to how good things happen. It was the method. Catherine Rose Wilcox, who would grow up to be the sharpest mathematician in 3 counties, and eventually the first woman on the Redemption Creek Town Council, would ask her father the same question from a different angle. She would ask what he had been thinking when he stood up in that courtroom and made those 7 words echo off every wall. He would tell her that he had not been thinking in the calculating way. He had been thinking in the way of complete certainty, the way you know a true thing before you have assembled all the arguments for its truth. He had been thinking that Ella Norris had done something extraordinary, and that extraordinary things required witnesses, and that he intended to be one. But all of that was ahead of them, on the far side of the August evening. Right now there was only the porch and the stars and the hand in his and the steady lamp at the end of the street and the sound of Redemption Creek settling into its night. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly everything.